The silence in the Academy's grand theater stretched for what felt like hours after the simulation ended. Alien students who had spent weeks mocking human military doctrine now sat frozen in their seats, staring at holographic displays that still showed the complete destruction their unrestricted warfare challenge had unleashed. Jake Morrison remained standing in the command area, looking out at hundreds of alien faces that showed expressions he had never seen before. Fear, confusion, and something that looked like the beginning of genuine respect. The confident mockery that had defined the past month was gone completely. Professor Zixtal was the first to break the silence. His crystalline form had dimmed to almost nothing, and when he spoke, his voice lacked the commanding presence that usually filled any room he entered. "Morrison," he said slowly, "explain what we just observed. Those weapon systems, those tactical capabilities, the level of destruction we witnessed. Our intelligence reports indicated no such human technologies." Jake looked around the theater one more time before answering. Every alien student was listening with complete attention. The casual dismissiveness of previous weeks had been replaced by something much more serious. "Your intelligence reports were accurate, Professor," Jake said calmly. "We don't use these weapons. We don't deploy these systems in actual warfare. We restrict ourselves from developing most of these capabilities for practical use." "But you just demonstrated them," Kethvar protested. His crystal body was barely glowing, and his usual confident tone had become uncertain and almost pleading. "If you possess such overwhelming destructive power, why do you limit yourselves?" Lisa Brooks stood up to join Jake at the front of the command area. "Because we learned what happens when we don't. Professor, you asked us to show you unrestricted human warfare. What you saw was a glimpse of what my species is capable of when we remove our ethical constraints." She activated her personal display, showing historical data from Earth that most aliens had never seen. Images of destroyed cities, poisoned landscapes, and weapons tests that had scarred entire continents appeared in the air above the theater. "Every restriction we follow, every rule we've imposed on ourselves, exists because we crossed that line before," Lisa continued. "The Geneva Conventions weren't created by weak people who were afraid of war. They were created by a species that had seen what warfare looked like without limits." Tony Martinez joined his teammates at the front. "You think our restrictions make us weak? Our restrictions make us safe to be around. Every rule we follow is a promise we've made to ourselves and to others. A promise that we won't become the monsters we're capable of being." The display showed more images from human history. Nuclear weapons that could turn entire regions into glass. Biological agents that could eliminate specific genetic groups. Chemical weapons that could poison atmospheres for generations. Artificial intelligence systems that could take control of planetary defense networks and turn them against their own populations. "You wanted to know why we limit ourselves," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent theater. "Because unlimited humans are a threat to everything, including themselves." Feltara's form flickered with colors that Jake was learning to recognize as deep confusion mixed with growing fear. "But in the simulation, you deployed weapons that could destroy entire star systems. You used tactics that violated every principle you claimed to hold sacred." "Exactly," Jake replied. "You wanted to see what humans are like without our restrictions. You got your wish. Now tell me, are you comfortable sharing a galaxy with the humans you just witnessed?" The alien students exchanged uncertain glances. The confident superiority they had displayed for weeks had evaporated completely. They were beginning to understand that they had been mocking something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. A young Saurok student near the back of the theater raised a trembling claw. "Your weapons in the simulation, the ones that could crack planets and poison entire star systems, these actually exist?" "The prototypes exist," Tony answered honestly, "locked away in facilities that most humans don't even know about. We built them because we had to understand what was possible. Then we decided that possible and acceptable were two very different things." Professor Zixtal's form brightened slightly as he began to process what he was hearing. "Your species developed these capabilities as a natural response to environmental pressures?" "We developed them because Earth is a dangerous world," Lisa explained. Humans evolved alongside predators that could kill us in dozens of different ways. We survived by becoming better at killing than anything else on our planet. But intelligence came with survival, and intelligence taught us that the same abilities that helped us survive could destroy everything we wanted to protect. She paused, looking around the theater at all the alien faces watching her with new understanding. Every species here has told us about their great military victories, Lisa continued. The conquests, the eliminated enemies, the expansion of territory through superior firepower. You've celebrated the destruction of your opponents as proof of your evolutionary success. Jake nodded grimly. Humans did the same thing once. We celebrated our victories, we glorified our weapons, we took pride in our ability to eliminate threats completely, and we almost ended our own civilization multiple times in the process. The restrictions you've been mocking, Tony added, are the most sophisticated weapons system we've ever developed. They're designed to contain the most dangerous predator in the galaxy. Us. A Mantari student clicked nervously with all four arms. You're saying that your ethical warfare doctrine is actually a weapon. Our ethical warfare doctrine, Jake replied, is a cage. It's designed to keep human military capabilities from becoming human atrocities. Every rule we follow, every limitation we accept, every moral consideration we make, is part of a system designed to prevent us from becoming something that even we can't live with. Professor Zixtal was quiet for a long moment, his 6 eyes studying the human students with what looked like new respect mixed with concern. So your species hasn't abandoned warfare. You've made warfare safer for everyone by making it less efficient. We've forced conflict to become more expensive, more complicated, and more limited, Lisa confirmed. Not because we can't fight total war, but because we know what total war actually costs. The theater remained quiet as alien students processed this information. Jake could see them trying to reconcile the humble, ethical humans they had been, mocking with the terrifying force they had witnessed in the simulation. Veskar, the scarred Sarok warrior, finally spoke up. His voice was much quieter than usual, lacking the predatory confidence he normally displayed. The countermeasures you used against our biological weapons in the simulation. They adapted faster than our computers could calculate new variants. We've been dealing with biological warfare longer than your species has existed, Tony replied matter-of-factly. We've seen what engineered plagues can do to populated worlds. The defensive systems you saw represent technologies we hope we never have to use. But you developed them anyway, Veskar pressed, though his tone suggested he already understood the answer. We developed them because we had to, Lisa answered. When you're capable of creating weapons that can eliminate entire species, you'd better be capable of defending against them too. The question isn't whether we can protect ourselves. The question is whether we can do it without becoming the very threat we're protecting ourselves from. A Velthari student whose form was pulsing with rapid color changes asked the question that many aliens were thinking. If you possess such capabilities, why do you allow yourselves to be threatened by other species? Why do you negotiate treaties, instead of simply demanding submission? Jake smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Because we've learned that there are worse things than losing a battle. There are worse things than being defeated by enemies. The worst thing is becoming something that your own people can't recognize. He activated the display again, showing images of human colonies throughout the galaxy, peaceful settlements, trading posts, research stations, and diplomatic facilities, on dozens of worlds. Every human settlement you see exists because we chose restraint over dominance, Jake explained. Every treaty we've signed, every negotiation we've participated in, every conflict we've resolved without violence happens because we decided that strength without wisdom is just another form of weakness. Professor Zixtal's form had returned to its normal brightness, but the patterns flowing through his crystal body were complex and thoughtful rather than condescending. Your species has developed an approach to galactic relations that no other civilization has attempted. We chose to survive ourselves, Lisa said simply. Not just as individuals or even as a species, but as the kind of people we wanted to be. The questions continued for another hour. Alien students who had spent weeks dismissing human military doctrine now wanted to understand every aspect of human ethical warfare. They asked about prisoner treatment, civilian protection, rules of engagement, and the psychological systems that allowed humans to maintain moral standards under extreme pressure. But the most important questions came from the faculty members who had remained to observe the demonstration. Morrison, Professor Zixtal said during a break in the student questions, "I need to understand something. In the simulation, your forces achieved complete victory in less than 6 hours. Your weapons and tactics were beyond anything we have on record for any galactic civilization. Are you telling me that humanity possesses this level of capability and chooses not to use it?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Jake replied. "But why?" asked another professor, a Velthari whose ancient form suggested centuries of military experience. "Why would any species deliberately limit their own survival advantages?" Tony stepped forward to answer. "Because we learned that survival isn't just about winning conflicts. It's about being able to live with yourself after the conflict ends. We discovered," Lisa added, "that you can win every battle and still lose everything that matters. Victory means nothing if you have to destroy your own humanity to achieve it." Jake nodded. "Our restrictions don't just protect our enemies from us, they protect us from ourselves. They ensure that when human soldiers return home from war, they're still human enough to live in the civilization they fought to defend." The alien students were taking notes now, asking serious questions about human military psychology, ethical decision-making under pressure, and the practical implementation of moral constraints in combat situations. The mockery had been replaced by genuine academic interest. As the formal session ended and students began filing out of the theater, Jake noticed that the conversations had changed completely. Instead of dismissive laughter about naive human warfare, alien students were debating the practical advantages of ethical constraints in long-term strategic planning. Kethvar approached the human students as they prepared to leave. His crystal body was still dimmer than usual, and his resonant voice carried none of its former arrogance. "Morrison, on behalf of all the alien students, I want to apologize for our behavior over the past month," he said formally. "We misunderstood the nature of your military doctrine completely." "No apology necessary," Jake replied. "You asked honest questions and you got honest answers. That's what education is supposed to be about." "But we mocked you," Veltara said, her form shifting through colors that expressed shame and regret. "We treated your ethical standards as signs of weakness when they were actually signs of wisdom." "You weren't entirely wrong," Lisa said, surprising the aliens. "Our restrictions do make us weaker in individual battles. They do make warfare more difficult and less efficient for us." "Then why maintain them?" asked a confused Mantari student. "Because," Tony explained, "we learned that being strong enough to win every battle isn't the same as being strong enough to win the peace that follows." Jake looked around at all the alien faces, seeing genuine understanding beginning to replace the confusion and fear of the past few hours. "You wanted to know why humanity restricts itself. Now you know. The question is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Professor Zixtal stepped forward, his crystalline form now glowing, with what Jake recognized as deep thought and new respect. "I believe this demonstration has taught us all something important about the nature of true strength." He paused, looking around the theater at students and faculty from dozens of species. "We have witnessed today that the most dangerous species in our galaxy is not the one with the most powerful weapons or the most ruthless tactics. It is the species that possesses ultimate power and chooses not to use it." As the humans left the theater and walked back to their quarters through corridors that no longer echoed with mocking laughter, Jake reflected on what had been accomplished. The alien students finally understood that human restrictions weren't signs of weakness but evidence of a strength so profound that it required constant vigilance to control. "Think they learned something?" Lisa asked as they reached their quarters. "They learned that we're not weak," Tony replied. "The question is whether they understand why that's actually more terrifying than if we were." Jake looked out at the stars through their window, thinking about Earth and the long journey that had brought humanity to this point among the galaxies. They're beginning to understand that in a universe full of species that celebrate their capacity for destruction, humans are unique. We're the only ones who have learned to celebrate our capacity for restraint. And that, Lisa concluded, makes us the most dangerous species in the galaxy, because we're the only ones who might actually be able to survive ourselves. The three humans stood together, looking out at the vast expanse of space where hundreds of alien civilizations pursued their own versions of strength and dominance. But now at least some of those civilizations understood that true power wasn't about what you could destroy. True power was about what you chose not to destroy, even when you could. The education was complete, and its lessons would echo through the galaxy for generations to come. The aliens had asked to see unrestricted human warfare, and they had learned that the most restricted humans were actually the most dangerous force any of them had ever encountered. Because humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology or their tactics, it was their wisdom to know when not to use either. The week that followed Keithvar's challenge was unlike anything the Academy had ever seen. Word of the upcoming simulation spread throughout the entire station. Students from every species talked about nothing else. Faculty members held emergency meetings to discuss the parameters. Even senior military officers from various galactic powers sent observers to witness the event. Jake Morrison spent his time quietly preparing, but not in the way the alien students expected. While they held loud planning sessions in the common areas discussing their tactics and boasting about their advantages, Jake worked alone in his quarters. He sent encrypted messages to Earth requesting permissions that had never been requested before. Lisa Brooks and Tony Martinez found him one evening, hunched over his computer terminal with a grim expression on his face. "What are you working on?" Lisa asked, sitting down beside him. Jake turned the screen so they could see it. The display showed a list of military technologies and weapon systems, most of which had been classified so deeply that even high-ranking officers weren't supposed to know they existed. "I'm cataloging what we're actually capable of," Jake said, quietly. "What we could do if we removed all our restrictions." Tony whistled softly as he read the list. "Jake, some of these weapons, they're theoretical, right? We never actually built them." "We built prototypes of everything on this list," Jake replied. "Then we locked them away and pretended they didn't exist. We told ourselves we were too civilized to use such things." Lisa pointed to one entry that made her stomach turn. "Planet crackers? We actually developed weapons that can split worlds apart?" "Among other things," Jake said grimly. "The question is, are we prepared to show the aliens what humanity is really capable of?" "In a simulation," Tony said quickly. "This is just a simulation, right?" Jake nodded. "Of course, but the simulation systems here are advanced enough to model our real capabilities accurately. When the aliens see what unrestricted human warfare actually looks like, they're going to understand why we restrict ourselves." The next morning brought a message from Earth that made Jake smile for the first time in weeks. Admiral Carter had sent a simple response to his request. "Permission granted. Show them what we are when we choose not to be human anymore." Meanwhile, the alien students continued their confident preparations. They had divided into teams based on their species, each group planning to demonstrate their most effective military doctrines. The Krillians would use their crystallization weapons to create permanent victories. The Belthari would phase through enemy defenses to strike from within. The Sarok would deploy biological weapons for maximum efficiency. Keithvar held court in the main common area, his crystal body resonating with excitement as he explained his strategy to anyone who would listen. "The beauty of this simulation," he said, "is that it will finally demonstrate the fundamental difference between practical warfare and naive idealism. When faced with real opposition, human ethical constraints will prove to be exactly what they appear to be, weaknesses disguised as virtues." Veltara floated nearby, her form shifting through confident colors. "I almost feel sorry for them. They have no idea what they've agreed to face." Veskar hissed in amusement, his scarred scales catching the light. "Perhaps this demonstration will finally convince them to abandon their childish restrictions and embrace proper military doctrine." Other alien students gathered around, eager to hear about the strategies their teams would employ. There was an atmosphere of excitement and anticipation throughout the academy. Everyone seemed certain about the outcome, everyone except the humans. Jake, Lisa, and Tony sat at their usual table in the dining hall, eating quietly while listening to the alien conversations around them. They could understand enough now to know that every species was confident they would easily defeat the handicapped human team. They really have no idea what they're asking for, Lisa said quietly. Should we warn them? Tony asked. Jake shook his head. They wouldn't believe us if we tried. They think they understand human capabilities based on our restricted warfare. They need to see the truth. Professor Zixtal approached their table, his 6 eyes focused intently on the human students. I wanted to speak with you about tomorrow's simulation, he said. Yes, sir, Jake replied, standing up respectfully. The other faculty members and I have been discussing the parameters. We want to ensure that this exercise is educational rather than simply humiliating. The professor paused, and Jake could see genuine concern in his crystalline features. Are you certain you want to proceed with this? The alien students are very confident, and they will not show mercy simply because you are guests at our academy. We understand, Professor, Jake said. We've accepted the challenge, and we intend to meet it fully. Very well, Professor Zixtal said slowly. But I want you to know that there will be no shame in requesting modified parameters. No one expects humans to compete effectively against unrestricted galactic warfare doctrines. After the professor left, Tony leaned forward. He's trying to give us a way out. Because he thinks we're going to be humiliated, Lisa added. He has no idea, Jake said quietly, that we're about to humiliate ourselves. Just not in the way he thinks. The simulation was scheduled for the next day in the Academy's Grand Theater. The facility was designed to accommodate the largest and most complex military exercises, with holographic projectors that could create entire star systems in perfect detail. Observer galleries surrounded the main floor, providing viewing areas for hundreds of spectators. When the day arrived, the theater was packed. Students from every species filled the seats. Faculty members occupied the front rows. Even some visiting dignitaries from various galactic governments had arrived to witness the event. The air buzzed with excitement and anticipation. Jake, Lisa, and Tony entered the theater together, wearing their simple blue uniforms. They looked calm and professional, but anyone who knew them well would have noticed the tension in their shoulders and the hard set of their eyes. The alien teams entered, with much more ceremony. The Krillians marched in formation, their crystal bodies resonating in harmony. The Velthari floated in perfect coordination, their forms shifting through spectacular displays of color and phase. The Sauroch moved with predatory grace, their scales gleaming like polished armor. Professor Zixtal took his position at the main control console. Welcome to the most comprehensive military simulation ever attempted at this academy, he announced. Today we will witness a direct comparison between unrestricted warfare and ethical combat doctrines. The professor activated the holographic display, and the theater filled with a 3-dimensional star system. Multiple planets, space stations, asteroid mining facilities, and shipping routes appeared in perfect detail. Civilian populations, military installations, and strategic resources were all clearly marked. The scenario is complex, Professor Zixtal explained. Each team must achieve complete control of this star system. All weapons and tactics are permitted. There are no restrictions except those imposed by the participants themselves. He looked directly at the human team. The humans have requested to maintain their ethical warfare guidelines. All other teams will operate without limitations. A murmur of anticipation ran through the observer galleries. This was exactly what everyone had come to see. A definitive demonstration of the superiority of unrestricted warfare over human moral constraints. Teams may begin when ready, the professor announced. The alien teams immediately launched into their planned strategies. The Krillians sent their fleets toward the central worlds, preparing to begin crystallization protocols. The Velthari ships began phasing in and out of normal space, positioning themselves for infiltration attacks. The Sauroch moved toward the outer planets, ready to deploy biological weapons against civilian populations. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded exactly as the aliens had planned. Their fleets advanced with confidence. Their strategies unfolded smoothly, and the human ships appeared to retreat toward defensive positions around the inner planets. As expected, Professor Zixtal commented to the observers, the humans are falling back to minimize civilian casualties. Their ethical constraints are already limiting their tactical options. In the observer galleries, alien students pointed and made sounds of amusement. The simulation was proceeding exactly as they had predicted. The humans were being driven back by superior tactics and unrestricted warfare. Then Jake Morrison's voice came over the simulation's communication system, and something in his tone made the entire theater fall silent. Alien forces, this is Human Command. You have initiated unrestricted warfare against human populations and interests. All previous tactical limitations are hereby suspended. You wanted to see what we're capable of? Here's your lesson. What happened next defied everything the aliens thought they knew about human capabilities. The human ships that had been retreating suddenly accelerated to velocities that should have been impossible. Lisa had removed all safety limiters from their engines, accepting massive mechanical failure rates in exchange for tactical speed that no alien fleet could match. What are they doing? Keithavar demanded as his crystalline formation was scattered by human ships moving faster than his targeting systems could track. The second change was even more dramatic. Tony had activated weapon systems that the aliens had never seen before. Kinetic bombardment weapons accelerated projectiles to significant fractions of light speed. AI-guided munitions that could think and adapt faster than organic reflexes could respond. Gravity manipulators that could crush entire fleets or tear apart planetary surfaces. These weapon systems weren't in our intelligence reports, Veltara protested as her phased ships were somehow being targeted and destroyed despite their incorporeal state. That's because, Jake replied calmly, we don't usually use weapons designed to crack planets. We don't typically deploy AI systems that can outthink organic brains in real time. We don't normally use kinetic weapons that can sterilize continents. The alien students in the observer galleries watched in growing horror as their supposedly superior fleets were systematically dismantled by human forces that seemed to have suddenly multiplied in both number and capability. Veskar's biological weapons launched toward human civilian centers were intercepted by defensive systems that didn't just neutralize the toxins. The human AI systems reverse-engineered the biological agents in milliseconds and deployed counter-agents that began affecting the Sauroch ships themselves. This is impossible, Veskar hissed. These are weapons of mass destruction. No civilized species would develop such things. Exactly, Jake Morrison replied, his voice echoing through the theater. We developed them. Then we restricted ourselves from using them. You wanted to see unrestricted human warfare. You're seeing it. Within 6 hours of simulation time, the entire alien force had been eliminated. Not defeated, not routed, but completely eliminated. Their ships were gone, their installations were destroyed, and their homeworlds in the simulation were facing complete ecological collapse from weapons the aliens had never conceived of. The theater sat in stunned silence. Alien students who had spent weeks mocking human military doctrine now stared at displays showing destruction beyond their comprehension. Faculty members looked at each other with expressions of shock and growing understanding. Professor Zixtal's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. What did we just witness? Jake Morrison stood up in the command area and faced the assembled observers. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced by something that made even the largest and most predatory alien students lean back in their seats. You witnessed why humans restrict themselves, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent theater. Not because we're weak, but because we're capable of being more terrible than you can imagine. Lisa Brooks joined him, her professional appearance unchanged, but her eyes reflecting something that made alien students look away. Every rule we follow, every limitation we accept, every ethical consideration we make exists because we know what happens when we don't. Tony Martinez completed the triangle, and together the three humans presented a picture that no alien in the theater would ever forget. They looked like ordinary people, wearing simple uniforms, speaking in calm voices. But everyone present now understood that beneath that ordinary appearance lay capabilities that could reshape star systems. You asked to see what humans are like. Without restrictions, Jake continued. You got your wish. Tell me, are you comfortable sharing a galaxy with the humans you just witnessed? The silence stretched on. In the observer galleries, alien students whispered to each other in confused and frightened tones. The confident mockery of previous weeks had evaporated completely, replaced by a dawning understanding of what they had been taunting. Professor Zixtal finally found his voice. Your species developed these capabilities naturally, without external influence? We developed them because we had to, Lisa answered. Humans evolved on a world that was actively trying to kill us. We survived by becoming very, very good at destroying things that threatened us. But we also learned, Tony added, that the same capabilities that helped us survive could destroy everything we cared about. So we chose to limit ourselves. Jake looked around the theater, meeting as many alien eyes as possible. Every species here has described their great military victories. You've celebrated the destruction of your opponents as proof of your superiority. You've taken pride in your ability to eliminate your enemies completely. The alien students shifted, uncomfortably in their seats. The victories they had boasted about suddenly seemed small and primitive compared to what they had just witnessed. Humans did the same thing once, Lisa continued. We celebrated our victories. We glorified our weapons. We took pride in our ability to eliminate our enemies, and we nearly destroyed ourselves in the process. The restrictions you've been mocking, Jake concluded, are the only reason humanity survived to reach the stars. We didn't limit ourselves because we were weak. We limited ourselves because we were too strong. Professor Zixtal's crystalline form had dimmed considerably. So your ethical warfare doctrine isn't naive idealism. It's a survival mechanism developed by a species that proved too dangerous for its own good. Now you're beginning to understand, Jake replied. We restrict ourselves not to protect our enemies, but to protect ourselves from becoming something we can't live with. The theater remained silent for several more minutes as everyone processed what they had witnessed and heard. The simulation displays still showed the aftermath of unrestricted human warfare. Star systems rendered uninhabitable, technologies that defied galactic understanding and destruction on a scale that made traditional warfare seem like children's games. Finally, Kethavar spoke, his crystal body dim and barely resonating. Morrison, on behalf of all the alien students here, I believe we owe you an apology. We misunderstood the nature of your restrictions. No apology necessary, Jake replied. You asked an honest question, and you got an honest answer. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge? The implications of what they had learned were beginning to sink in. The galaxy's supposedly most advanced military minds had just discovered that the species they had been mocking as naive and weak was actually the most dangerous force any of them had ever encountered, and that species had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of their capabilities, to restrict themselves for the good of everyone. The education was complete, but the real learning was just beginning. The third week at the academy brought new challenges for the human students. Jake Morrison woke up each morning knowing that he would face another day of barely hidden mockery and dismissive comments. But something was changing. The questions from alien students were becoming more serious, more thoughtful. Some aliens were beginning to realize that human military restrictions might not be signs of weakness after all. The change started during Professor Zixtal's advanced strategy class. The lesson was about something called total war versus limited engagement. And Jake could tell from the professor's tone that this was going to be another opportunity to highlight human limitations. Class, Professor Zixtal began, his crystalline form catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the room. Today we examine the fundamental difference between effective species and those who impose artificial limitations upon themselves. Jake, Lisa and Tony exchanged glances. They had heard this kind of introduction before. It usually meant they were about to become the subject of academic ridicule. The professor activated the holographic display, showing various galactic conflicts from the past 1,000 years. Each example showed alien species achieving quick, decisive victories through overwhelming force and complete destruction of enemy capabilities. The Krillian Empire expanded through the Outer Rim by converting entire star systems to crystal matrices, Professor Zixtal explained. This strategy eliminated resistance permanently and provided valuable resources for continued expansion. Kithvar, the young Krillian student who seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking humans, resonated with pride. His crystal body glowed brighter as he basked in the praise for his species' achievements. The Velthari Consortium achieved dominance in the nebula sectors by phasing their fleets directly into enemy ship cores. The professor continued. This technique allowed them to bypass all defensive systems and destroy enemy vessels from within. Veltara's form flickered through several different phases, showing off her species' abilities. The other alien students watched with obvious admiration. The Sorok hegemony conquered the spiral arm through the strategic deployment of biological weapons that eliminated specific genetic markers, Professor Zixtal said. This approach allowed them to claim territory without damaging valuable infrastructure. Veskar hissed softly in satisfaction, his scarred scales reflecting his pride in his ancestors' accomplishments. Each of these campaigns represents the proper application of military force, the professor concluded. Quick, decisive, and permanent victory achieved through the intelligent use of available capabilities. Then his 6 eyes focused on the human students, and Jake felt the familiar weight of impending humiliation. Now we come to our human guests, Professor Zixtal said, and Jake could hear the condescension in his voice. Despite possessing nuclear weapons capable of planetary destruction, despite developing biological agents that could eliminate entire ecosystems, despite creating artificial intelligences that could wage war at the speed of thought, humans consistently choose to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Several alien students made sounds that Jake was learning to recognize as laughter. But this time, not all of them were laughing. Some were listening with what looked like genuine curiosity. Kethvar raised a crystalline appendage. Professor, surely this cannot be by choice. Perhaps humans simply lack the intellectual capacity to wage war effectively. An interesting hypothesis, Professor Zixtal replied. Morrison, perhaps you can enlighten us. Why does your species deliberately handicap itself in warfare? Jake stood up slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of alien eyes upon him. But this time, instead of mockery, he saw genuine interest in some of those eyes. The alien students wanted to understand, not just laugh. Because we've seen what happens when we don't, Jake said simply. Elaborate, the professor commanded. Jake took a deep breath. Our restrictions exist because we learned that total war doesn't just destroy your enemies. It destroys everything worth protecting. We developed rules of engagement because without them, we became something we didn't want to be. The classroom was quieter than usual. The constant background noise of alien conversations had stopped. Everyone was listening. So you admit it, Veltara said, her form shifting colors rapidly. Humans are naturally violent, but you've artificially suppressed your instincts. How did such a confused species ever achieve interstellar travel? We didn't, Lisa said quietly, standing up to join Jake. You found us first, remember? We were still contained to our own system when your exploration fleets arrived. Because you were too busy fighting ethical wars among yourselves to develop proper technology, sneered a Mantari student, his insect-like form clicking with what passed for amusement among his species. But Professor Zixtal raised a hand for silence. His expression had changed. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine scientific curiosity. This is interesting, the professor said slowly. Morrison, are you suggesting that your species developed these restrictions as a survival mechanism? That you limited your warfare capabilities to prevent self-destruction? Jake nodded. Exactly, sir. We learned that species capable of total war eventually turn that capability on themselves. The same weapons and tactics that defeat external enemies can destroy your own civilization if you're not careful. But surely this is theoretical speculation, Kethvar protested. You cannot prove that unrestricted warfare leads to self-destruction. Tony stood up to join his teammates. Actually, we can. We almost did it. Multiple times. The alien students leaned forward with interest. This was new information that hadn't been covered in their intelligence reports about human capabilities. Explain, Professor Zixtal commanded. Tony activated his personal display, showing images from Earth's history. During our Cold War period, two major human nations built enough nuclear weapons to destroy our entire planet several times over. We came within minutes of total nuclear exchange on multiple occasions. The display showed missile silos, nuclear submarines, and weapons that could turn continents into radioactive wasteland. The alien student studied the images with growing interest. We developed biological weapons that could have eliminated all human life, Lisa added. We created chemical agents that could poison entire atmospheres. We designed artificial intelligences that could have taken control of all our military systems. And we chose not to use them, Jake concluded. Not because we couldn't, but because we realized that winning wasn't worth the cost of becoming monsters. The classroom was completely silent now. Even Professor Zixtal seemed to be processing this information with new understanding. You're saying, Velterra said slowly, that your restrictions aren't signs of weakness but signs of wisdom gained through near catastrophe? That's exactly what we're saying, Jake replied. Every rule we follow, every limitation we accept, represents a lesson we learned the hard way. A Sorok student near the back of the room raised a clawed hand. But if you possess such destructive capabilities, why do you allow other species to threaten you? Why do you negotiate instead of simply eliminating opposition? Jake smiled grimly. Because we've learned that there are worse things than losing a battle. There are worse things than being defeated by your enemies. The worst thing is becoming something that your own people can't live with. Professor Zixtal was quiet for a long moment, his crystalline form dimming as he considered what he had heard. When he spoke again, his tone was different. More respectful, more thoughtful. Your species has developed an unusual approach to survival, he said. Most civilizations that develop total war capabilities either destroy themselves or use those capabilities to dominate others. You have chosen a third path. We chose to survive ourselves, Lisa said. Not just as individuals or even as a species, but as the kind of people we wanted to be. The rest of the class passed in unusual quiet. The alien students asked questions, but they were serious questions now. They wanted to understand how a species could develop such deadly capabilities and then choose not to use them. After class, instead of the usual mockery, the humans found themselves surrounded by curious aliens asking genuine questions about human military philosophy. The tone had changed completely. Do you really believe that your restrictions make you stronger? Asked a young Krillian whose crystal body pulsed with uncertainty. We believe our restrictions keep us human, Jake replied. And staying human is more important than winning battles. But what if staying human gets you killed? Pressed Veskar, his yellow eyes gleaming with predatory interest. Then we die as humans, instead of living as monsters, Tony answered. The questions continued. For almost an hour, some aliens were beginning to understand that human military doctrine wasn't based on naive idealism, but on hard-earned wisdom about the costs of unlimited warfare. That evening, the atmosphere in the Academy dining hall was different. Alien students were still talking about the humans, but the conversations were more serious now. Jake could understand enough of their languages to know that they were debating whether human restrictions represented weakness or a more sophisticated form of strength. The change became more obvious over the next few days. In simulation exercises, alien students began paying closer attention to human tactics. They were studying how the humans balanced military effectiveness with ethical considerations. Some were even asking if they could learn human approaches to prisoner treatment and civilian protection. But not all the aliens were impressed by this new understanding. Kethvar seemed particularly annoyed that his fellow students were taking humans more seriously. During one class, he made a comment that would change everything. I grow tired of this philosophical discussion, Kethvar announced during a break between lectures. His crystal body resonated with frustration. We have spent weeks listening to humans explain why they choose to be less effective in warfare, but talk is easy. Action reveals truth. He turned to face Jake directly. I propose we settle this debate with a practical demonstration. Let us organize a grand simulation. Unrestricted warfare, no artificial limitations. Let the humans participate, with all their precious rules intact, and let us demonstrate once and for all whether their approach represents wisdom or weakness. The common area fell silent. Students from every species turned to watch the confrontation. Jake could feel the weight of their attention as Kethvar continued. We have heard enough theories about human military philosophy, the Krillian student said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. Let us see how those theories perform against practical application of superior tactics. Veltara's form flickered with excitement. An excellent idea. We could use the Academy's advanced simulation systems to create a truly comprehensive scenario. Multiple star systems, suggested Veskar, his scarred scales gleaming under the lights. Civilian populations, industrial targets, fleet actions, everything. Other alien students began voicing their approval. The idea of a grand demonstration was appealing to them. They had been listening to human explanations for weeks, but they still believed that when it came to actual combat, their unrestricted approaches would prove superior. Professor Zixtal entered the common area and immediately sensed the tension. What is this discussion about? He asked. Kethvar straightened with pride. Professor, I have proposed a comprehensive simulation to test the effectiveness of various military doctrines. Human ethical warfare versus proper unrestricted tactics. The professor's 6 eyes focused on Jake with obvious interest. And what do the humans think of this proposal? Jake looked around the room at all the alien faces watching him. Some showed eager anticipation, others displayed confident superiority, and a few seemed genuinely curious about the outcome. He thought about the past 3 weeks of mockery, the gradual change in alien attitudes, and the growing understanding that human restrictions weren't signs of weakness. We accept, Jake said quietly. The room erupted in excited conversation. Alien students began immediately discussing the parameters of the simulation, the scenarios they would use, and the strategies they would employ. Professor Zixtal raised a hand for silence. This will require careful planning and official approval. Such a comprehensive simulation has never been attempted at the Academy. With respect, Professor, Kethvar said, this is exactly the kind of practical learning experience the Academy was designed to provide. We have the technology, we have willing participants, and we have an important question to answer. The professor nodded slowly. Very well. I will speak with the other faculty members about organizing this simulation. If approved, it will be scheduled for next week. As the crowd began to disperse, Veltara floated over to the human students. Her form was shifting through colors that Jake was learning to recognize as anticipation mixed with confidence. I hope you understand what you have agreed to, she said. This will not be like the limited exercises we have done in class. We will use every advantage we possess, every capability at our disposal. We understand, Lisa replied calmly. Do you? Veskar approached, his reptilian form towering over the humans. Because we will not hold back out of courtesy or fairness. We will demonstrate why unrestricted warfare has allowed our species to dominate the galaxy, while yours remained trapped in a single star system. Tony smiled grimly. We're looking forward to it. After the aliens left, the 3 humans sat alone in the common area. The weight of what they had agreed to was beginning to sink in. Jake, Lisa said quietly, are you sure about this? They're talking about unrestricted warfare. No rules, no limitations, no ethical considerations. I know exactly what they're talking about, Jake replied. The question is, do they know what they're asking for? What do you mean? Tony asked. Jake stood up and walked to the large window that looked out into space. Earth's sun was visible in the distance, a tiny point of light that represented home and everything they were fighting to protect. They want to see what humans are like, without our restrictions, Jake said slowly. They think they understand what that means. They think it means we'll be less effective, less dangerous, less capable. He turned back to his teammates, and there was something in his eyes that made both Lisa and Tony lean forward with interest. They have no idea that our restrictions exist to protect them from us, not us from them, Jake continued. They're about to learn why humanity needed those restrictions in the first place, Lisa's eyes widened as she understood what Jake was implying. You're not suggesting we actually... I'm suggesting we show them exactly what they've asked to see, Jake said. They want unrestricted human warfare? They want to see what we're capable of when we take the gloves off? Tony grinned fiercely. Let's give them the education they're asking for. Jake nodded grimly. It's time they learned that some restrictions exist not because you can't cross the line, but because you shouldn't. And it's time they understood what happens when humans decide that the line no longer applies. The three humans looked out at the stars, each thinking about the demonstration that was coming. The aliens thought they were about to prove their superiority over naive human warfare doctrine. They had no idea they were about to discover why human restrictions were the most sophisticated weapon system ever developed, designed to contain the most dangerous predator in the galaxy. The education was about to begin, and it would be more comprehensive than any of the alien students had imagined. The second week at the Galactic Military Academy was worse than the first. Jake Morrison sat in the dining hall, pushing his food around his plate while listening to the constant hum of alien conversations around him. Most of the time he couldn't understand what they were saying, but he caught enough words to know they were talking about the humans. Lisa Brooks and Tony Martinez sat across from him, eating in silence. The three humans had learned to sit together at meals because no alien students invited them to join their tables. It wasn't that the aliens were openly hostile. They were just dismissive, like the humans were children who didn't belong in adult conversations. Did you hear what happened in simulation class today? Tony asked quietly, glancing around to make sure no aliens were listening. Jake nodded grimly. The combat simulation had been a disaster. The scenario was simple: defend a space station from enemy attack. The alien teams had completed the exercise in less than 30 minutes. The human team had taken over 2 hours and still failed. We followed every protocol correctly, Lisa said, stabbing her food with more force than necessary. We identified the civilians, we established safe evacuation routes, we tried to minimize structural damage to the station. And we lost, Jake replied, completely and totally lost. The problem wasn't that the humans didn't understand tactics or strategy. Jake had graduated top of his class from Earth's Naval Academy. Lisa was an expert in combat engineering. Tony had more field experience than most officers twice his age. But every decision they made in the simulations was slowed down by considerations that the alien students never worried about. While the Krillians simply converted sections of the space station to crystal to block enemy advancement, the humans had to consider whether civilians might be trapped in those areas. While the Velthari phased through walls to attack enemies from behind, the humans checked to make sure their weapons wouldn't hit anything important on the other side of their targets. The worst part, Tony continued, is that they're not even trying to hide their amusement anymore. He was right. In the first week, the alien students had at least pretended to take the humans seriously. Now they openly laughed during classes when human tactics were discussed. Some had started making jokes about human warfare in languages they thought the humans couldn't understand. Jake had been studying alien languages in his spare time, using the Academy's computer system. He was beginning to understand more than the aliens realized. Yesterday, he had heard a group of Sorok students calling humans the baby warriors and making hissing sounds that passed for laughter among their species. Look, Lisa said, nodding toward the entrance of the dining hall. Professor Zixtal had entered, followed by several other faculty members. The alien students immediately straightened up and began talking more quietly. The professors commanded respect throughout the galaxy, and their presence changed the atmosphere in any room. Professor Zixtal's 6 eyes swept across the dining hall and stopped when they found the human table. He walked over with the other professors following behind him. "How are you finding your studies, humans?" and he asked, his crystal body reflecting the dining hall lights in complex patterns. "Very educational, sir," Jake replied, standing up out of respect. "Excellent. I trust you are learning valuable lessons about the realities of galactic warfare." The professor's tone was pleasant, but Jake detected something underneath it. Not hostility exactly, but a kind of condescending amusement. "We are learning a great deal about different approaches to combat, sir. Lisa said carefully. Indeed. Speaking of which, tomorrow's class will focus on historical military campaigns. I would like each species to present examples of their most effective victories. Professor Zixtal paused, and Jake could swear he was enjoying what came next. I have assigned the humans to present last. I am curious to see how your ethical warfare principles have served you in actual conflicts. After the professors left, the three humans sat back down. Around them, alien students were talking excitedly about the assignment. This was clearly going to be another opportunity for the humans to be humiliated in front of the entire class. What are we going to present? Tony asked. We could talk about the Allied victory in World War II, Lisa suggested. Or maybe the Korean conflict. Jake shook his head. They're going to focus on everything we did wrong. Every time we held back, every time we chose the harder path because it was the right thing to do. So what do? Tony asked. We tell the truth, Jake said. We present our history honestly and let them draw their own conclusions. That evening, the humans worked late into the night preparing their presentation. They reviewed human military history, looking for examples that showed both human capabilities and human restraint. It was harder than they expected because human warfare was full of examples of both incredible heroism and terrible mistakes. The next day's class was held in the Academy's largest lecture hall. Students from every species filled the seats, and Jake noticed that word had spread about the presentations. There were more aliens in attendance than usual, including some senior students who normally didn't attend basic classes. The Krillians went first. Kethavar, the young Krillian who seemed to enjoy mocking humans the most, presented their species' conquest of the Outer Rim. The holographic display showed entire star systems being converted to crystal, with enemy fleets trapped in crystalline matrices that would hold them forever. The beauty of Krillian warfare, Kethavar explained, his crystal body resonating with pride, is its permanence. When we defeat an enemy, they remain defeated. There are no prisoners to guard, no occupied territories to police, no resistance movements to suppress. Our enemies become part of our empire in the most literal sense. The class watched as the display showed billions of alien beings frozen in crystal, their faces locked in expressions of terror or defiance for all eternity. The Krillian students resonated in harmony, creating a musical tone that expressed their satisfaction with their ancestors' achievements. The Velthari went next. Veltara, a student whose light form flickered between different colors as she spoke, described the phasing purge. Her species had infiltrated enemy cities by becoming incorporeal, then materialized inside their victims' bodies. The effectiveness of this strategy, Veltara explained as her form shifted to show different phases of matter, was its psychological impact. Enemy populations surrendered entire planets rather than face the possibility of our infiltration. The fear of death from within proved more powerful than any external weapon. The holographic display showed cities full of aliens who had died from the inside out, as Velthari warriors materialized within their bodies. It was horrifying to watch, but the alien students nodded approvingly at the tactical brilliance. Thar Sorok presentation was even worse. Veskar, a particularly scarred warrior, whose scales bore the marks of many battles, described biological warfare campaigns that had eliminated entire species. His yellow eyes gleamed as he explained how Sorok scientists had developed toxins that targeted specific genetic markers. The advantage of biological warfare, Veskar hissed, is its selectivity. We could eliminate enemy populations while leaving their cities, resources, and infrastructure completely intact, clean, efficient, and economical. The display showed planets where entire civilizations had simply died in their homes, leaving behind empty cities that the Sorok had claimed without firing a shot. The silence of the dead worlds was somehow more disturbing than explosions or battles would have been. Each presentation was more brutal than the last. The Mantari described coordinated swarm attacks that had overwhelmed enemy defenses through sheer numbers and perfect coordination. Other species presented campaigns involving mind control, reality, manipulation, and weapons that could destroy souls as well as bodies. Finally, it was the humans' turn. Jake stood up and walked to the front of the class, feeling every alien eye focused on him. The large holographic display activated, showing a map of Earth during the mid-20th century. "This is World War II," Jake began. "It was one of the largest conflicts in human history, involving most of the nations on our planet." The display showed the global nature of the conflict, with battle lines drawn across continents and oceans. The scale was impressive even by galactic standards, covering an entire world in warfare that lasted for years. The war began when aggressive nations invaded their neighbors and attempted to conquer large portions of our planet, Jake continued. The defending alliance had to fight across multiple fronts against enemies who used concentration camps, slave labor, and systematic murder of civilian populations. The display showed some of the horrors of the war: bombed cities, concentration camps, civilian casualties. But it also showed something else: hospitals treating wounded enemies, prisoner of war camps where captives were fed and housed according to international law, and military forces that struggled to minimize civilian casualties even while fighting for their lives. Despite fighting against enemies who showed no mercy to civilians, Jake said, the defending alliance maintained strict rules about the treatment of prisoners and the protection of non-combatants. Several alien students made sounds of disbelief. The idea of maintaining ethical standards while fighting for survival seemed absurd to them. The alliance possessed weapons capable of destroying entire cities, Jake continued. The display showed atomic bombs being developed and tested. They had biological weapons, chemical weapons, and the scientific knowledge to create much worse, but they chose not to use most of these weapons. "Why?" called out a Krillian student. "If your enemies were so terrible, why did you limit yourselves?" Jake paused for a moment, looking out at the sea of alien faces. "Because we decided that winning the wrong way was the same as losing." The classroom erupted in laughter. Students from multiple species made sounds of amusement and disbelief. The idea that there could be a wrong way to win seemed ridiculous to them. "Let me understand this correctly," Kethavar said, his crystal body resonating with mockery. "Your species chose to make victory more difficult for yourselves? You deliberately handicapped your own war effort?" "We chose to remain human while fighting monsters," Lisa said, standing up to join Jake. "We chose to be better than our enemies instead of becoming them." This brought even more laughter from the alien students. The concept seemed completely foreign to them. Why would any species choose to be better than their enemies when they could choose to be more effective instead? "But you did win this war, didn't you?" Professor Zixtal asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Yes," Jake replied. "We won, but it took longer and cost more lives than it would have if we had abandoned our principles." "Fascinating," the professor said. "So you achieved victory despite your ethical constraints, not because of them." Tony stood up to join his teammates. "Actually, sir, we think our ethical constraints were part of the reason we won." The classroom fell quiet. This was a new idea that none of the aliens had considered. "Explain," Professor Zixtal commanded. "Our enemies made alliances based on fear and conquest," Tony said. "Our side made alliances based on shared values and mutual respect. Our enemies had to control occupied territories with force. Our allies fought alongside us willingly. More importantly," Lisa added, "our enemies became so focused on causing suffering that they wasted resources on cruelty instead of strategy. They became less effective warriors because they enjoyed being monsters." Jake nodded. "We learned that maintaining our humanity made us stronger, not weaker. When people fight for principles they believe in, they fight harder and longer than people who only fight for conquest." The alien students were no longer laughing. They looked confused and uncertain. The idea that ethical constraints could be a source of strength rather than weakness was completely new to them. "Interesting theory," Professor Zixtal said slowly. "But surely you can see that your approach is inefficient compared to the campaigns we have just witnessed." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But our way meant that when the war ended, we could still look at ourselves in the mirror. We could still live with what we had done. And more importantly," Lisa added, "the people we liberated trusted us. The nations we helped rebuild became our allies instead of our enemies. Our victory didn't just end the war, it created a foundation for lasting peace." The professor was quiet for a long moment, his six eyes studying the human students with what might have been new interest. Around the classroom, alien students were whispering to each other in confused tones. "Your presentation raises questions that bear further consideration," Professor Zixtel finally said. "However, I believe most would agree that your approach, while admirable in its idealism, represents a luxury that most species cannot afford in the harsh realities of galactic warfare." As the class ended and students began filing out, Jake heard conversations in multiple languages. The aliens were discussing what they had heard, and their tones suggested they were not entirely dismissive anymore. Some seemed genuinely puzzled by the human approach to warfare. Walking back to their quarters, the three humans were surrounded by a small group of alien students asking questions. Most of the questions showed that the aliens still didn't understand, but at least they were asking instead of just laughing. "Do you really believe that being nice to your enemies makes you stronger?" asked a Mantari student, her compound eyes reflecting dozens of tiny images of Jake's face. "We believe that staying true to your values makes you stronger," Jake replied. "Not being nice, but being right." "But what if your values get you killed?" pressed a Sorok student. "Then we die as humans instead of living as monsters," Lisa answered. The alien students exchanged glances. The concept was still foreign to them, but they were beginning to understand that the humans weren't naive children playing at war. They were experienced warriors who had made deliberate choices about how they fought. That evening, as the humans sat in their quarters reviewing the day's events, Tony made an observation that stuck with Jake. "They're starting to ask different questions," he said. "They're not just mocking us anymore. They're trying to understand us." "Is that good or bad?" Lisa asked. Jake looked out at the stars, thinking about home and the long journey that had brought humanity to this point. "I think it's the beginning of them realizing that maybe we're not as weak as they thought. Maybe our restrictions don't come from weakness at all." "What do you think they'll realize next?" Tony asked. Jake smiled grimly. "They might start wondering what we're actually capable of when we choose to set those restrictions aside." The transport ship slowly came to a stop at the giant space station. Jake Morrison looked out the window at the massive structure that would be his home for the next 6 months. The Galactic Military Academy was bigger than any building he had ever seen on Earth. It looked like a small city floating in space, with thousands of lights twinkling across its surface like stars. Lisa Brooks sat next to him, checking her blue uniform one more time. She was nervous but tried not to show it. Her hands shook slightly as she smoothed down her jacket. This was the first time humans had been invited to study at the galaxy's most important military school. Everything had to go perfectly. The future of human relations with dozens of alien species might depend on how well they performed here. Tony Martinez was already standing up, eager to get started. He had been waiting for this chance his whole life. The chance to learn from the best military minds in the galaxy. The chance to prove that humans belonged among the stars. His excitement was clear on his face as he pressed against the window, trying to see everything at once. The three humans gathered their simple bags and walked off their ship. The docking bay was enormous, with ships from dozens of different worlds coming and going constantly. The first thing that hit them was how different everything looked. The walls were made of some kind of crystal that glowed with soft light. The ceiling was so high they could barely see it in the distance. And everywhere they looked, there were aliens. Jake had seen pictures of other species before, but seeing them in person was something else entirely. Tall creatures with skin like living crystal walked past them without a second glance. These were the Krelians, famous throughout the galaxy for their military might. Their bodies looked like they were made of blue and green gems that caught the light and threw it back in beautiful patterns. They moved with perfect coordination, like dancers who had practiced the same routine for years. Floating near the ceiling were the Velthari. Their bodies seemed to be made of light itself, shifting between solid and transparent as they moved. Jake watched one of them phase right through a wall like it wasn't even there. The alien's form became misty and see-through, passed through solid metal, then became solid again on the other side. He had read about their abilities in the briefing files, but seeing it was amazing and a little scary. A group of lizard-like beings stood in formation near the main entrance. These were the Sorok, and they looked exactly like the dragons from old Earth stories. Their scales were dark green and black, and their yellow eyes seemed to see everything around them. One of them looked directly at Jake and smiled, showing rows of sharp white teeth that looked like they could bite through steel. Near the Sauroch were creatures that looked like giant insects walking on two legs. These were the Mantari, with compound eyes that sparkled like jewels and 4 arms that moved independently of each other. They spoke to each other in clicks and buzzes that hurt Jake's ears. Lisa nudged Jake's arm hard. "We need to find the registration desk," she whispered. "Stop staring. We're already getting enough attention." She was right. Jake could see other aliens pointing at them and talking in languages he didn't understand. Some looked curious, others seemed amused, and a few appeared dismissive. The humans were clearly the topic of many conversations around them. They walked through the main hall, trying not to stare at all the different aliens around them. Some species Jake didn't even recognize from the briefing materials. There were beings that looked like walking trees with bark for skin and leaves for hair. Others seemed to be made of living metal that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury. One group appeared to be clouds of gas that somehow held together in humanoid shapes. The diversity was overwhelming. Every few steps, they saw something new and impossible. Creatures with too many eyes, beings with no visible mouths, aliens that glowed with their own light, and others that seemed to absorb light around them like living shadows. Finally, they found the registration area after asking directions 3 times. A Krillian officer sat behind a desk that looked like it was carved from a single piece of purple crystal. When he saw the humans approaching, his 6 eyes focused on them with obvious curiosity. Each eye was a different shade of blue, and they all moved independently as he studied the 3 newcomers. "You must be the human exchange students," the officer said. His voice sounded like wind chimes mixed with the sound of breaking glass. "I am Officer Zethkol. Welcome to the Galactic Military Academy." Jake stepped forward and tried to stand as straight as possible. "Thank you, sir. I'm Commander Jake Morrison. These are Lieutenant Lisa Brooks and Sergeant Tony Martinez." Officer Zethkol looked them up and down slowly, taking in every detail of their appearance. "Your uniforms are very simple," he observed. "Most species wear armor or ceremonial gear that shows their military traditions and honors their ancestors." Jake looked around and realized the officer was right. Every other alien student he could see was wearing elaborate clothing. The Krillians had crystalline armor that covered their bodies in geometric patterns. The Velthari wore robes that seemed to be made of captured starlight. The Sauroch had metal plates decorated with symbols and battle honors. "We prefer practical clothing, sir," Lisa replied. "Our uniforms are designed for function rather than ceremony." The Krillian officer made a note on his crystal tablet with a tool that looked like a tiny lightning bolt. "Interesting philosophy. You will be assigned quarters in Section 7. Classes begin tomorrow at 0800 station time. Your first class is Advanced Tactical Warfare with Professor Zixtal." The officer handed them each a small crystal chip. "These are your identification badges. They will allow access to your quarters and classroom areas. Do not lose them." As they walked away from the registration desk, Jake noticed that other students were watching them. Some seemed curious about the new species. Others looked amused, like they were watching children play dress-up. A few were clearly talking about the humans, though Jake couldn't understand their languages. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he tried to ignore it. Their quarters were in a section of the station that seemed designed for visiting students. The corridor was lined with doors marked with symbols from different alien languages. The human quarters were simple, but comfortable. 3 separate bedrooms connected to a common area with a large window that looked out into space. Jake stood at the window and stared out at the view. He could see Earth's sun in the distance, just one star among millions. It looked so small and far away that it was hard to believe his entire species lived around that tiny point of light. "This is really happening," Tony said, sitting down heavily in one of the chairs. The furniture was clearly designed to accommodate multiple species, so it was adjustable but felt strange. "We're actually here. We're going to study alongside the most advanced military minds in the galaxy. And tomorrow we start classes with some of the same aliens who have been conquering star systems while we were still figuring out how to leave our own planet," Lisa added. She was unpacking her few belongings with careful, precise movements. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars and thinking about home. Remember what Admiral Carter told us before we left? We're not just here to learn. We're here to represent humanity. Everything we do reflects on our entire species. Every mistake we make will be remembered. Every success might open doors for other humans. The weight of that responsibility felt heavy on his shoulders. Back on Earth, he was just another military officer. Here, he was the face of humanity to dozens of alien civilizations. They spent the evening reading their course materials and trying to understand what they would be studying. The textbooks were translated into English, but many of the concepts were completely alien. Military tactics based on abilities humans didn't have, strategies that assumed technologies humans hadn't developed, battle plans that involved capabilities beyond human understanding. The next morning, they made their way to their first class. The academy was like a maze with corridors that curved and twisted in ways that seemed to ignore normal geometry. Other students moved through the halls with confidence, obviously familiar with the layout. The humans had to check their maps several times to avoid getting lost. The classroom was enormous, with seats arranged in tiers that rose up toward the ceiling like an ancient amphitheater. Students from dozens of different species were already seated, talking amongst themselves in various languages that created a constant buzz of conversation. The sound was overwhelming, like being inside a beehive. Jake, Lisa, and Tony found 3 seats together near the middle of the room. As they sat down, Jake noticed that the conversations around them were getting quieter. Other students were looking at them with obvious interest. Some leaned over to whisper to their neighbors, pointing discreetly at the humans. The chairs were designed to accommodate different body types, so they adjusted automatically when the humans sat down. Jake's chair extended leg supports and adjusted the back angle. Lisa's chair widened to accommodate wings she didn't have. Tony's chair lowered and tilted forward, apparently designed for a species that preferred to perch rather than sit. Professor Zixtal entered the room, and Jake understood immediately why this Krillian commanded respect throughout the galaxy. He was taller than any of the other Krillians Jake had seen, probably 8 feet tall even without counting the crystal formations that grew from his head like a crown. His crystal body was a deep purple color that seemed to pulse with inner light. When he moved, his faceted skin threw rainbow patterns across the walls. "Welcome to Advanced Tactical Warfare," the professor began. His voice filled the entire room without effort, resonating in frequencies that Jake could feel in his bones. "In this class, you will learn the principles of unrestricted combat. Every species in this room has evolved unique advantages that make them formidable in warfare." The professor gestured toward different groups of students as he spoke, and Jake noticed that each group sat together by species. The mixing that he had hoped to see wasn't happening. Everyone stayed with their own kind. The Krillians possess natural armor that can withstand most conventional weapons, the professor continued. Our crystalline structure allows us to coordinate perfectly with our fellow soldiers through harmonic resonance. We can share thoughts and battle plans instantly across vast distances. Several Krillian students straightened with obvious pride. Their crystal bodies began to glow brighter, and Jake could hear a soft musical tone as they resonated together. The Velthari can phase through solid matter, making them nearly impossible to contain or capture, Professor Zixtal continued. Their ability to become incorporeal gives them tremendous tactical advantages. They can infiltrate any position, bypass any defense, and strike from within enemy formations. The floating Velthari students pulsed brighter at the praise, their form shifting between solid and transparent in what Jake assumed was their version of pleased acknowledgement. The Sarok have natural resistance to most toxins and can survive in environments that would kill other species, the professor said. Their predatory instincts make them excellent hunters. They can track enemies across multiple star systems and never lose their prey. The lizard-like students hissed softly, in approval, a sound that made the hair on Jake's arm stand up. The Mantari can process multiple streams of information simultaneously and coordinate complex operations with perfect precision, the professor continued. Their hive mind capabilities allow them to function as a single military unit across entire battlefields. The insect-like students clicked and buzzed in harmony, creating a sound that somehow conveyed satisfaction and pride. And then, Professor Zixtal continued, his 6 eyes focusing directly on the human students. "We have our human guests." The room became completely quiet. The buzzing, hissing, and resonating stopped instantly. Jake felt every alien eye in the EU classroom turned toward him and his teammates. The silence was so complete that he could hear his own heartbeat. "Humans are unique among galactic species," the professor said, and Jake couldn't tell if his tone was respectful or mocking. "They are the only species that deliberately limits their own military capabilities through what they call rules of engagement and ethical warfare guidelines." A few alien students made sounds that Jake thought might be laughter. The Sorok hissed in what sounded like amusement. The Mantari clicked in rapid patterns. Even some of the Krillians resonated in frequencies that felt dismissive. "It is truly fascinating," the professor continued, walking closer to the human students. "To encounter a species that has chosen to handicap itself in warfare, they have developed weapons and tactics, then created rules that prevent them from using those weapons and tactics effectively." More laughter from the alien students, louder this time. Jake felt his face getting hot, but he kept his expression neutral. Lisa and Tony were doing the same, but he could see the tension in their shoulders. A young Krillian near the front of the room raised his hand. His crystal body was bright blue with silver veins running through it like lightning. "Professor Zixtal, will the humans be participating in our combat simulations? It seems unfair to handicap them with their self-imposed limitations." "An excellent question, Kethvar," the professor replied, with what Jake was becoming certain was amusement. "The humans will indeed participate in all exercises. We will treat this as a learning experience for everyone. Perhaps we can better understand how arbitrary moral restrictions affect military effectiveness." Jake wanted to stand up and object to the word arbitrary, but he forced himself to remain seated. For those unfamiliar with human military doctrine, Professor Zixtal continued, beginning to pace in front of the class. "Humans refuse to target civilian populations directly. They provide medical care to captured enemies. They even warn their opponents before attacking in many situations." The base classroom erupted in laughter. Students from different species were turning to look at the humans with obvious amusement and disbelief. The sound was overwhelming and humiliating. "Surely this is a joke," called out a Velthari student whose form was flickering rapidly with what Jake assumed were colors of disbelief. "No species could survive galactic warfare with such naive restrictions." "And yet," the professor replied, spreading his arms wide, "here they are. The humans have requested admission to our academy to learn proper military doctrine. Perhaps they recognize the limitations of their current approach." Jake clenched his fists under his desk. He wanted to stand up and explain that human military restrictions had good reasons behind them. He wanted to tell these aliens about the lessons humanity had learned through hard experience and terrible mistakes. But he remembered Admiral Carter's words about representing his species with dignity and restraint. The class continued for another hour, with Professor Zixtal explaining various tactical concepts that assumed capabilities humans didn't possess. Throughout the lesson, alien students continued to make comments about human warfare limitations. They seemed to find the idea of ethical warfare genuinely funny, like adults laughing at children's games. When class finally ended, the human students found themselves surrounded by curious aliens. Most seemed friendly enough, but their questions made it clear they viewed humans as inferior warriors. "Is it true that humans actually follow rules during combat?" asked a Sorok student whose scales were scarred from what looked like many battles. "Do you really provide medical care to enemies who are trying to kill you?" wondered a Mantari, whose compound eyes reflected dozens of tiny images of Jake's face. "How do you win battles if you warn your enemies before attacking?" asked another Krillian, his crystal body resonating with confusion. Jake answered their questions, as politely as he could, but he could see that his explanations only made the alien students more amused. To them, Human military ethics seemed like the behavior of children playing war games rather than serious soldiers preparing for real combat. As they walked back to their quarters that evening, the corridors seemed longer and the alien stares more obvious. Groups of students would stop talking when the humans passed, then burst into conversation again once they were gone. "This is going to be a long 6 months," Tony finally spoke up when they were safely back in their quarters. "They think we're weak," Lisa added quietly, slumping into her chair. "Every single one of them thinks we're some kind of joke." Jake looked back toward the classroom building through their window, thinking about all the alien students who had laughed at human military doctrine. Their laughter still echoed in his ears. "Let them think that," he said slowly. "They don't understand what our restrictions really mean. They don't understand why we need them." "What do you mean?" Tony asked, looking up with interest. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching alien students walk past their window in groups, still talking and gesturing in ways that suggested they were discussing the amusing humans and their naive ethical warfare. "They think our rules make us weak," Jake finally said, his voice low and serious. "They have no idea that our rules exist because we know exactly how strong we can be without them. They don't understand that we've seen what happens when humans fight without restrictions." Lisa looked at him sharply. "Jake, you're not thinking about—" "No," Jake said quickly. "But maybe it's time they understood that our restrictions aren't signs of weakness. Maybe it's time they learned that some limits exist not because you can't cross them, but because you shouldn't."